In March, I ended up looking at the most popular or most bought stories on Amazon in the science fiction genre. And within those top 10 books, two of them were from this Trespass collection. One of them was Wildlife by Jeff Vandermeer, and the other one was Backbone of the Worlds by Stephen Graham Jones. And even though at the time I was kind of like iffy on the wildlife story because it didn't seem particularly science fiction to me, I ended up reading that as one of the first books in this TBR because I was just so curious about why it landed itself in science fiction. And I was curious about the Trespass collection as a whole. They have these beautiful bright covers on them. They are a collection of like short stories, so they're really quick reads. And all of the authors who participate in the Trespass collection are popular, well-known authors. Quite a few of them actually have other stories that are on my list of things to get to. And I wanted to take this opportunity to get a little taste of them from the Kindle Unlimited store and see if I wanted to invest in a larger story. The first book is going to be The Tiger Came to the Mountain by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Apologies if I mispronounced that name. I'm really terrible pronouncing things. Once I saw this book, I was really interested to read it because this is the same author who wrote Mexican Gothic, which is a story that's definitely on my TPR. There's nothing else by Silvia Moreno-Garcia on Kindle Unlimited, so reading The Tiger Came Down to the Mountains is going to be really your first and only taste through Kindle Unlimited of her work. On Goodreads, this book is sitting at a 3.89 star rating with 1,160 ratings and 145 reviews. Personally, I'm surprised this story has such a low rating. It could be the Amazon categories it falls under. It's sitting at number 1 in historical fiction anthologies, number 3 in 45-minute science fiction and fantasy short reads, and number 8 in historical Caribbean and Latin American fiction. It's not that any of these categories are wrong. I think that this could have fallen into like a magical realism category pretty easily. It almost could have fallen into like a fairy tale or folklore category. And I think it might have gotten better reviews sitting in one of those categories versus the ones that were chosen. I could be wrong. Truthfully, I don't read a lot of historical fiction in almost any genre. So it's possible that I just don't understand the conventions of that genre. But this story was great. Like, I loved it. I gave this a 5-star review, so I am really perplexed why it's sitting at a 3.89. I thought the prose were like lyrical and beautiful and had like a little bit of this melancholy sadness just sprinkled throughout the whole thing. Discussing the jungle and discussing some of the cultural things gave it like this bright, colorful feel to it. It was still sad and like stressed and struggling. It sort of like had this clash between bright, colorful, makes you think like vibrant and happy, and like the overall tone being sad and like almost in a desperation sort of area. I thought overall the prose also like made excellent use of simplicity. Like the sentence structure was really short. Everything was sort of basic and to the point. It wasn't very flowery. And its simplicity actually elevated it to a more poetic phase for me. There is elegance in the simplicity, and I really enjoyed that. There's this seamless incorporation of myth within the place the narrator's from in Jules Verne. I love that she sort of combined classic like English literature and some of that mythology with like a more place located kind of myth. It was really beautiful and done just so well. Too, I just kind of like enjoyed the atmosphere. Our narrator is born in like this transition period. She's like on the cusp of this old primitive world way of living, way of viewing things, and like moving into modernity. She talks about like the generation after her moving out of the farming communities and like going towards the city and wanting to live this shinier, more modern life and not valuing these older things. And it's just interesting to be born in like that transition generation. It's like the standing on this edge of something, and I just really enjoy feeling that way. It really gives me like the Schrodinger's cat feel, like the cat is simultaneously alive and dead in the box until you open it up. A lot of times I feel like people standing on this line or in this place in the world, they've both chosen their culture and their traditional ways, and they've chosen the modern times and modern way to look at things. It's just a fascinating like place to be at, and it embodies a certain kind of like feeling and thing that you can explore that you can only do in these kind of stories, and I just love it. There's something about this story too, even though it's set like very culturally in a specific time and place, it also has like this epic Greek Roman mythological feel to it. For me, the pacing in the story was perfect. I got everything I needed at the right time in the right place. I was never bored. I never had to put the story down. I never considered DNFing it. It was just wonderful. It was like such a wonderful journey for me. And I think as like a first book in a Trespass collection, this is a great choice. I think this story really benefits from being in a speculative fiction collection. That whole idea that something magical or something reality breaking could be just around the corner really helps elevate possibilities, and it helps like open the reader's mind up to considering like,
maybe there is a ghost here. Maybe there's aliens. Maybe that's what I'm about to find out. That really could be where the story's going.
Where if we were telling this story in a straight literary category, you sort of feel like tied to the real world and only things within the real world can happen. So you wouldn't think ghosts or aliens or crazy mythological creatures. You'd know all of that was like kind of hogwash, and it would pull away from like the dream and the narrative that's being spun here. Lastly, does this story fit in a Trespass collection? To me, Trespass collection, its unifying theory is that we should have some character versus environment conflict going on in the story. The Tiger Came to the Mountains does have that. So yes, The Tiger Came Down to the Mountains fits perfectly to me in this Trespass collection. The second book in the series is Wildlife by Jeff Vandermeer. This was the first one that I personally read. I have a lot of conflicting feelings about this particular story, but before we get into like my personal take on it, I just want to talk about how other people perceived it. It's got a 3.38 star rating on Goodreads, and it has 650 ratings with 104 reviews. The Amazon categories it falls into is 90-minute science fiction and fantasy short reads, which FYI is a category I want to explore more in the future, horror anthologies, and horror short stories. I didn't recognize Jeff Vandermeer when I first started reading this series, and of all the authors, he is one of them that has the most available on Kindle Unlimited. I didn't necessarily dislike this story, but it just went off the rails at the end. But before I get to the end, let's go ahead and talk about leading into it, because there's so much that's excellent and compelling in this story. I love the characterization. I really felt the way that he wrote his female character was fascinating and realistic, and I just loved her to pieces. And I was really involved in her story. I wanted to know what had happened to her. I wanted to know what was going to happen to her. I was so invested and drawn in. And this story specifically has a really interesting formatting thing. Instead of the chapters going chronologically from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 all the way to the end, and he actually starts the chapters at 12 and then counts down like 12, 11, 10. I loved that touch. It was another way to show this tension between the female character and this other guy like building and coming to a head. It was like the countdown to their eventual clash and explosion. The font was also really a great pick here. I think the font for all of these stories formatting wise is the same, and that's like a nice little detail and thread to weave in to sort of show it's a collection. The cover art too sort of indicates that the Trespass collection is a collection and that they're sort of supposed to be united, which is good because you have a different author telling each of these novellas, and the theming is otherwise kind of hit and miss on whether or not it feels like cohesive. So I'm glad minimally they put the formatting work in on it. All the way up to the end, this story was moody, it was interesting, I loved the players, all of the characters were really great. I felt like this story really explored dissolving a marriage, seeing that like unravel and fall apart, and seeing the aftermath of that for this woman in particular. And there's like this building, this internal escalation, everything feels like the soda bottle that you're shaking up, getting ready to explode out. Even though all of this was happening and it was working for me and it was going so well, the ending is not the bottle exploding and you getting that release. The ending of this story is like if you were shaking that soda bottle, shaking it up, getting ready for it to have all this pressure and explode. And instead of getting to explode the soda bottle, getting that pressure buildup release. Like you found out actually there was no soda bottle and you had imagined the whole thing the whole time. That's what this ending was like to me. I just hated it. I hated this ending so much. It felt really abrupt and jarring. It felt like a forced ending so that you could specifically put this in the science fiction fantasy category. And actually, I thought it was like a great example of speculative fiction done terribly, because the speculative element in speculative fiction should help reinforce and drive your themes. In this story, you could have invited a speculative element, like sort of woven it in and introduced it a little bit earlier, done a little bit more to lead up into it, or you could have done a different speculative element than the element that this story has, and it would have been interesting. The ending is bad. It comes out of nowhere, and not in an interesting,
you were fooled or misled
kind of way, just like, well, that was fucking random for no goddamn reason. It's not where this story was going. And it makes you kind of mad because everything is so good and you were so invested and you wanted something so much, and what you got was not at all related. I still would read something from him in the future. I still do want to read more from him in the future. I felt like there was a really strong like character versus environment conflict. And unfortunately, because of the way the ending goes, I have to say like it wasn't really about that at all. A strong feeling of place and a feeling of like wildness and environment in this story. There is not a character versus environment conflict happening, and the fact that you realize that retroactively is part of what's wrong with this story. Next is going to be The Backbone of the World by Stephen Graham Jones. This was definitely my favorite of all of the stories in the Trespass collection. I love this story to pieces. Stephen Graham Jones is definitely an author on my list. He doesn't have anything else on Kindle Unlimited, so if you're looking to get a taste of his work on the Kindle Unlimited platform, then The Backbone of the World is going to be it. This particular short story has a 3.99 rating with 645 ratings and 113 reviews. There's another one of the stories in this Trespass collection that's criminally underrated. I gave it 5 stars. I love it. I think it's so much fun. The Backbone of the World is in Horror Anthologies books, Horror Short Stories, and Horror Anthologies Kindle store. Back in March, it was sitting in the science fiction Kindle store as well, which is how I came across it. I'd argue too that there's a potential for it to be in magical realism or contemporary fantasy. This story does so well setting mood and tone. It starts us off with a woman who is living alone in her later years in life, like 50s and 60s, I want to say. So not too old, but up in the upper end of middle age, I guess. And her husband has recently been jailed because he accidentally ran over and killed 2 children within the reservation. Obviously, the death of these 2 children is very sad, but at the same time, like, it's also sad to see our female character alone. I love the framing of this because even though we keep re-emphasizing that him running over those 2 children was wrong, we keep coming back to this idea that Millie is also being punished for what her husband did. She had planned her life out, waking up every day, having coffee with him, spend time together with the love of your life kind of moment. And that's been stolen from her by this accident that happened. It made me question our method of getting justice. I'm not saying that Millie's husband doesn't deserve to be punished. I'm just wondering if there was a way that he could have made retributions to the community or been punished in a way that didn't also hurt Millie so much. The person in jail is not the only person suffering necessarily. And in this case, where Millie's husband accidentally killed these 2 children, and he should have been more aware. He was like in a school scenario. I mean, there's no culpability for this guy, right? But he also didn't like go out and maliciously kill these children either. It was like an honest accident. Was sending him to jail really the right thing? It doesn't make those kids come back, and it doesn't necessarily, I feel like, make that family feel any better about what happened. I could be wrong. We're only getting Millie's perspective on this, but it just was an interesting way to look at the situation and to like keep coming back to feeling bad for Millie. I didn't feel bad for her husband necessarily, but I did feel a lot of like emotional attachment to Millie as a character. I really did empathize with her and feel like something had been taken from her through no fault of her own. And she was in this like in-between space trying to figure out what she was going to do now. And you know, guys, I talked about it in my March description, but I'll talk about it again here. I love prairie dogs. I know the prairie dogs are the antagonists. I know that Millie hates them and that the book does everything it can to like explain why we should all hate the prairie dogs, but they're just so much fun. I love them. I love them popping in and out of their little holes. I love their bounce back and their resilience. I'm sad that one horse died from an injury they got from a prairie dog hole, but overall, like, I'm team prairie dog all the way. I kind of love that Millie keeps trying all these things, can't seem to get rid of the prairie dogs. And the introduction of Frog, like, as an odd character, I found Frog just odd enough. Like, you could have given me any kind of premise for her and I would have bought it. You could have told me she was a time traveler. You could have told me she was like a spirit animal transformed into a human form. You could have told me that she was a embodiment of some various form of God or like an embodiment of the sacred land or anything like that. And I'd be like, yep. Or you could have just told me Frog was like a weird person. I'd be like,
yep, that checks out too.
The way she was depicted and played left a lot of room for interpretation and possibility, and I loved that. I love the incorporation of some traditional native mythology, and I love the way that Millie believed, like, both in modernity and also in these traditional myths. Like, both these things are true and not a contradiction, and I can experience something that's mystical in the modern world, and that can just be a thing and be true. You know, I like stories that play it that way a lot. I'm gonna jump into spoilers right now with The Backbone of the World because we cannot go without discussing a certain element of the story. But right here, spoilers, this was the most hopeful version of the pod people that I had ever read. Discovering that you could create replicas of other people from this like thing in the ground was played off in like a hopeful redemption arc kind of way. And it's really interesting because it puts you in a position where you're like rooting for the pod people and like celebrating the occurrence of the pod people. And I love that we took a scenario that's like classic horror, classic like they're replacing us terror, and we found a situation where this is a good thing. I am genuinely happy for Millie, even though it's got like major Pet Cemetery vibes because she's like asleep and she wakes up and her husband is there, and we all know it's not really her husband, it's like a replica. Like, you really do feel hopeful that maybe Millie is now going to get her happily ever after the rest of her life with her husband kind of thing. And like, you're like, problem solved, and I'm happy. Although, you know, later I was thinking about the story and I was like,
who knows how these pot people are going to respond. Maybe they're going to kill Millie and replace her too. Maybe it is fine and it's not going to be a big thing. I don't know.
Too, it made me wonder for the first time about her husband. Until this point in the story, her husband has only had utility to me in how he made Millie feel. But like, for the first time I was thinking about like him in prison. Millie stops visiting him because now she has a replacement husband here. He just spends the rest of his life alone in prison without any support or love. Like, that feels not right. I felt a little bit sad for him. But I don't know how it plays out, you know? Like, it was interesting when originally the, like, prairie dogs gave back the horse that started her on this quest to kill them. And then they gave back the 2 children because those children were dead. So, like, these replacements could just step into their lives and live naturally and there'd be no duplicates or whatever. But in the husband situation, he is alive. He's just in jail. What if one day he gets released from jail? You know, is he able to pick back up his life? Does he have to become someone new? It just puts a lot of questions like that out into the world too. And I can see why it would be labeled as a horror story because technically the pod people, the alien or the magic thing replacing us is terrifying, and the idea that you won't know who's real and who's not anymore, and what does that even mean when you can be like cloned like this, like that's potentially horrifying, and it is a eventual end of the world scenario. But at this point in time, you know, I had just bought into Millie's story and been so invested in Millie that I didn't really care about what this meant for the larger world. I was just happy that she was going to get a happy ending. So I love this story. It's definitely my favorite. There's definitely a bunch of different ways you could interpret it. It's super speculative. And even though they do give you like a definitive,
this thing is an alien and one day they see this alien like a god, and that explains Frog is a time traveler.
You could go a bunch of different interpretations in this story, and they would all be equally valid. And this story is a character versus environment. We do go through all the different ways that Millie tries to kill off these groundhogs. Even though you sort of suspect there's something more, something supernatural going on for a long time, it's just like different ways that you could kill an invasive pest. Next is going to be Stag by Karen Russell. It's sitting at a 3.28 star rating with 420 ratings and 61 reviews. This is my second favorite book in the series. It's also criminally underrated. I'd never heard of Karen Russell before. She doesn't have anything else on Kindle Unlimited, but I am interested in reading more from her in the future because this was so fun. This story, Stag, sort of has an absurdist premise where the main character has a one-night stand with a woman and gets invited to a divorce party, and they're celebrating the divorce in the exact same way you would celebrate a wedding. And their justification for this is to destigmatize divorce and to celebrate people moving on into the next phase of their life. And it's slightly absurd, slightly humorous, slightly serious. It's played both ways. But I really enjoyed it because there's a lot of angst in this story and sadness and disappointing things happening. But it's sort of played in a humorous, comedic, larger than life kind of feel. And I liked the comedic element. I liked the juxtaposition of those two things together. And I liked too that our main character, he's kind of this older, jaded guy. He sort of tells the story that in a way that implies one thing happened, and you get to the end and you find out something else happened. So it has a little bit of a twist reveal, which I appreciated. I also like this story because when I read it, I still assumed that this was a supernatural science fiction kind of story. And in this one, it's the first time I got to see that not all the stories were necessarily speculative in nature. The story is more straight literary. It's still deeply enjoyable. And I guess the whole divorce party thing is technically speculative because we don't do that. But I kept waiting for supernatural elements to crop up into the story. I kept seeing all these places they could be inserted, and the story kind of resists that. And eventually you realize there's not going to be any supernatural elements. There's not going to be some kind of woo-woo moment. The story just is what it is. And it sort of hits you in a second wave that I felt to be really interesting and heavy impact for me. Yeah, this story is sitting in 1 hour science fiction and fantasy short reads, Kindle single science fiction and fantasy, and 1 hour literature and fiction short stories. And I didn't find anything science fiction and fantasy about this story, to be honest. I'm not really sure why it's in those categories, but it was a fun read. I really enjoyed it. And if you're looking for that science fiction fantasy element in it, I could see why you would rate this low. There are some elements that are a little bit beyond what you would get in day-to-day life. They're a little overcolored, but it's not enough to classify into science fiction and fantasy in any kind of satisfying way, at least not for me. Still, the writing was really good, and I thought the balance of this deeply melancholy and almost poignant story going on with things that were funny, juxtaposing that and executing it well, just showed that Karen Russell is an amazing writer and definitely someone I need to look more into in the future. Next is A Righteous Man by Tochi Ubuchi. And I'm super sorry because I definitely didn't pronounce that correctly. I didn't know anything about this author going in. He does have some more Kindle Unlimited stories, and I'm sort of considering picking them up. I'm not 100% in or out on them based off of reading this one story. The Righteous Man sits in historical fiction anthology, 45-minute science fiction and fantasy short reads, and Black and African American fantasy and fiction. This is the first book that I read that I considered DNFing, even though it's really short, and I considered not finishing it based off of how incredibly arrogant and superior the narrator was. I'm glad I pushed through it and read through it because the transformation in the narrator is really worth reading, and there's really a very interesting, kind of mysterious story happening in A Righteous Man. It just takes a little time to get to it. And the other thing I'm glad I read this story all the way through for is they start to talk about hyena men in this story, and while this is a colonial time period piece, hyena men are actually a thing that happen in modern times now. and it dates back to like an ancient tradition. And I ended up pausing my read of this story to read more about hyena men and their history and their lore and what their place is in modernity. This story is like more ambiguous than all the others as far as ending goes. It's a little bit like Wildlife in that it sort of ends abruptly and goes in a slightly unexpected manner. But I think Righteous Man does it way better than Wildlife did, because like there were these magical supernatural elements kind of woven in, not to mention that Righteous Man were following like a Christian preacher in Africa. So like you're expecting some of that religious mystical element to happen. Also, you know, like your narrator is a little bit unreliable, like the way he's describing the native African people is like fucked up, and the way he's describing his Christian God and the way that he believes in miracles, like all that like kind of blends together, and you're like,
all right, I don't really know what's real, and I'm not really 100% sure where this story is going.
That like unsureness lends itself to make this story a little bit better. And it also like does more to set up your expectations for something magical or unbelievable to happen. Then the last book in this collection is going to be Bloody Summer by Carmen Maria Machado. Again, sorry, I can't pronounce anything correctly. I did know this author because they wrote The Dream House, and that's on my TBR of books that I want to read in the future. I'm actually putting the Dream House lower on my TBR based off of my experience with Bloody Summer. This story is sitting at 3.68 stars. It has 512 ratings and 74 reviews. Its categories in 45-minute science fiction and fantasy short reads, horror short stories, and Kindle singles science fiction and fantasy. I love the concept of this story, like so much. And the first person discussion, as well as some of the rhymes that are given in the story, were fun. There's like things about this that I really love. But the way the story was told, like the wrapper it was in, was all this like college study professor kind of thing, and like a collection of different resources like put together for research and maybe for a larger paper. All of that was like gross to me and boring and really dry and unpleasant. I almost put this book down, and I ended up rating it 3 stars, even though I love the story and even though like the last chapter of this book is really good. I don't think you need almost any of the rest of this to enjoy the last section of this book. Just go read the last chapter, you know, and skip all this dry academic researchy collection kind of junk. I did like some of the hand games, and I like some of the discussions about how like child's hand games often describe like horrific things in history or mark like kind of warnings and urban legends. That was fun to me, but it wasn't so fun as to justify the layout of this story or like the dry pulling apart of it. Like if that's what I wanted, I'd have gone and read that. I came to this for like a fiction story and like a fictional moment. I did love the interview at the end and the last chapter. That was so good. And if we had just had that, this would be much higher rated, to be honest. But again, I just didn't like the wrapper. And I don't think this story was a character versus environment story at all. Like I didn't get any character versus environment feel off of this. So that made me sad too. Overall, I'd say that the Trespass series starts with a bang and ends with a whimper. I would go ahead and check the series out. You can read each story within an hour. And if you have Prime, you can also access these stories. So either Kindle Unlimited or Prime will let you get to these stories. Some of them have audio recording with them, so you could listen to them instead of reading them. I don't recommend that though, because I listened to some of the voice audio and I found it to be like not done very well. But that's gonna be my take on these stories. I highly recommend them. I had a lot of fun. Are you guys reading any fun short stories in science fiction or fantasy? Let me know in those comments down below, because I feel like this has opened a world of like 45-minute, 90-minute science fiction or fantasy reads to me, or horror anthologies, and I would just love to like get a couple recommendations and to read a couple more things like this under my belt. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep reading. Bye!